welcome to the Kennedy Center lecture series. This, of course, is our final event on the last day of class. We've had a really terrific, I think, series this semester on our theme, Race, Myths, and Realities. And we're very excited today to have the Kennedy Research Fellows. These are a couple of our best undergraduate students who are going to be presenting the work that they've done on our semester's theme. Now, of course, we would hope that in the fall semester, we will be able to have in-person lectures again, but we are grateful at this time for the technology that still allows us to have these events. Now, let me make one announcement to begin with. At 2 o'clock today, so shortly after we finish here, there will be a panel discussion entitled Data Careers for Social Impact. And in this panel discussion, we have several BYU alumni who will be discussing how they have made a career using data analytics to help create social impact. We'll put a link in the chat so that you can get further information on that if you wish. Now, during the spring and summer terms, of course, we usually have very few events and lectures, but I will just invite you to join us again in fall semester when we'll be having a new series of lectures and presentations. This time, our theme will be about the challenges facing the international order. Now, we will begin our as we normally do with BYU, with an opening prayer. And I think that our person assigned to give the prayer has not joined us. She may be having technical difficulties, so I'll go ahead and offer that opening prayer, and then we'll get started. Father in heaven, we're grateful for this day, for the opportunity we have to gather together, for the technology that allows us to do so, and to hear these presentations from these two excellent students. We're grateful for their work and the time that they have put in and their willingness to share it with us, and ask thee to bless them, that they may be able to present their work in a way that is pleasing to them. Please bless us, that we will have our minds open and engaged, and we can learn and grow from this experience together. And we pray for this in the name of Jesus Christ, amen. All right, well, we will first hear today from Kaitlin Hoelzer. Now, she has a class at 12:30, so what we're going to do is we'll have, after my introduction, she'll give her presentation, then we'll have a brief question and answer period for Kaitlin. As we normally do, I'll ask you to send me a message in the chat if you have a question for her, so that I'll be able to sort of curate that question and answer period. Now, Kaitlin Hoelzer is an English major with minors in history and global women's studies. She is from Minnesota and enjoys taking walks with her dog, knitting and skiing. And she will graduate from BYU next week in April. And so, but she's going to start a master's degree in English here at BYU with an emphasis in American literature. Her paper is entitled Something Large and Old Awoke, Ecopoetics and Compassion in Tracy K. Smith's Wade in the Water. So please join me in giving a virtual welcome to Kaitlin Hoelzer.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen so that y'all can see my slides. All right. Pulitzer Prize winner and former US Poet Laureate Tracy K. Smith's fourth volume of poetry, Wade in the Water, examines racial and environmental injustice, participating in what Catherine R. Linz has termed African-American reclamation ecopoetics. So ecopoetics refers to any poetry that takes the natural world as its inspiration and subject. And whereas eco-criticism has traditionally focused on pastoral aesthetics, Linz and other Black critics have expanded ecopoetics to address environmental degradation and the structural oppressions that connect environmental damage with ongoing racial injustice through both formal and thematic elements. African American reclamation ecopoetics is a protest of human injustices to both other humans and non-human nature. And African American reclamation ecopoetics is a strong part of the contemporary Black poetic tradition. Wade in the Water connects environmental degradation and racial injustice, but also responds to these issues with a call for compassion, entering current conversations about restorative justice for Black people in America today. Wade in the Water identifies the link between racial injustice and environmental degradation, but at the same time, Smith's book is infused with a compassion that provides optimism in the face of oppression. The poems Wade in the Water and An Old Story in particular draw attention to the damage done to both the environment and Black people in America, countering these injustices with a compassion deemed essential to dismantling unjust systems and bringing about healing. The title poem, Wade in the Water, exposes the violence that extractive capitalism inflicts on both Black people and the land by evoking slavery, which was one of extractive capitalism's earliest manifestations. Smith wrote this poem after seeing the Geechee Gullah Ring Shouters perform, and at first glance, Wade in the Water seems to be about a lively performance with handclaps and stomps. However, the dance in question has a tragic history that recounts the enslavement of the dancers' ancestors. Geechee Gullah, which is the region along the Atlantic coast that includes parts of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, also refers to the enslaved people who once worked there in cotton, rice, and indigo fields. It also refers to the unique language and art that was able to evolve in this isolated region. The Geechee Gullah Ring Shouters today perform dances and songs that were created when their ancestors were enslaved in this region. Extractive capitalism relies on an underclass of exploited laborers created by the historical enslavement and disenfranchisement of African and Indigenous populations, and maintained by modern-day anti-Black racism. Wade in the Water is rooted in extractive capitalism's long history of slavery, domination, and exploitation. The poem's description of the rusted iron chains someone was made to drag are not simply an artful metaphor, but are the literal history of Geechee Gullah dance. The acknowledgement of the legacy slavery has left in the United States in Wade in the Water can also be linked to environmental degradation. The legacy of human and natural plunder depicted in the poem, as dancers pretend to wade in the water, invokes the water that carried enslaved people from Africa to the Geechee Gullah region. This description of the water where they pretended to wade, in particular, also allows the poem to hint at environmental degradation. In Wade in the Water, the Atlantic Ocean is metaphorically tainted by the forcible importation of enslaved Africans. But with the knowledge that extractive capitalism is what created slavery, it follows that the waters of the world have also been and will continue to be literally threatened by the careless environmental practices of extractive capitalism. Angela Davis and Macarena Gomez Barris assert that extractive capitalism creates the need to dominate the land as well as people, stripping it of saleable resources and contaminating it with the toxic byproducts of production. Therefore, Wade in the Water participates in the tradition of African American reclamation ecopoetics by articulating an understanding of the ways in which extractive capitalism links both environmental degradation and racial injustice. An Old Story, the second poem I'll talk about, closes Smith's book with a haunting image of the devastation caused by domination and exploitation of both the land and Black bodies in the United States, arguing that these inextricably linked injustices are structural, not individual. The poem voices a land that is livid and ravaged, and a people whose every hate has swollen to a kind of epic wind, describing the damage done to both the earth and humans as the worst in us taken over. An Old Story asserts that individual beliefs become codified by the dominant group, making individual hate swell to epic proportions, cementing a structural injustice in the United States that is more far-reaching than any one individual's action. That the poem presents the end of the world as something that involves both structural environmental degradation and institutionalized human hatred argues that when racial injustice goes unchecked, so does environmental degradation, and vice versa. Because environmental degradation and racial injustice work together, these oppressions multiply for Black people. Black people not only face the daily threat of racial violence, but are also more likely to live in areas where the environment is poor, due to environmentally harmful governmental policies and corporate actions that disproportionately affect poor communities of color. An old story asserts the structural nature of the problems of environmental degradation and racial injustice. Like Wade in the Water, an old story connects racial injustice and environmental degradation. However, an old story points this conversation toward future possibilities for compassionate change. The swollen hate and ravaged land build upon each other until they are countered in the poem with people taking new stock of each other and the land. An old story thus outlines the coming problems society will face if oppressive systems are not replaced by systems of justice and compassion. In this way, the poem reflects Lynn's argument that African American reclamation ecopoetics take responsibility for the future, demanding stewardship of nature and, in a manner of speaking, of other humans. An old story, while condemning the injustices of the past, is also forward-looking, seeking to rectify past problems of environmental degradation and racial injustice in order to build a more equitable future for all. Wade in the Water contends that neither racial nor environmental injustices can be defeated without compassion. Indeed, the book underscores compassion as a force for liberation, justice, and healing, also offering a new way of envisioning the focus on the future of African American reclamation ecopoetics. Wade in the Water asserts that compassion leads to community, allowing effective resistance movements because it disavows hierarchy and acknowledges the problems people face, creating both individual and structural change. The poems Wade in the Water and An Old Story in particular emphasize compassion as a weapon in the battle for human dignity and justice. These poems do not suggest that one should ignore the reality of injustice or rely on trite calls to just love everyone as the solution to systemic problems. Rather, they pair compassion with an acknowledgement of ecological disaster and racist violence, because compassion requires that one acknowledge the injustice of the past and present in order to find healing in the future. Nor are calls for compassion a way to avoid concrete action, because feeling with requires both individual and collective work. Compassion does not mean ignoring difficult realities, but instead allows us to confront these negative realities in a manner that is life-affirming and life-enhancing. Thus, compassion, in the sense Smith and other Black theorists use it, motivates care and community to combat injustice and thus create a more equitable future. For instance, Wade in the Water personifies compassion, arguing that compassion itself has the power to temper injustice and loose chains. Smith describes one of the Geechee-Gullah ring shouters greeting her by saying, "I love you." The woman repeats, "I love you," again and again as she continued down the hall past other strangers. In the poem, though the group does not know one another, they are pierced suddenly by pillars of heavy light. Compassion is infused throughout the performance, manifesting itself in every hand clap, every stomp, in rusted iron chains, and in the water. As compassion pierces the scene with light, the rusted iron chains of racial injustice and environmental degradation are unclasped and left empty. This image clearly communicates the immense power compassion has to combat injustice. It is compassion itself, not any individual, that breaks the chains. Further, in the poem, compassion drags us to those banks and casts us in, as well as pushes itself into each audience member, scraping at each throat. Wade in the Water mimics a baptism and confirmation by the hand of compassion. That compassion itself performs these actions again illustrates its potency in resisting oppression. Compassion is not merely the motivator of liberation, it is the liberator itself. The book's final poem, An Old Story, invokes a creation myth of sorts to offer a vision of healing through compassion and argue that the structures of the world must be reimagined. An Old Story begins with a storm, ravaged land, and swollen hate, a picture of what the world might become if the twin oppressions of racial and environmental injustice are left unchecked. Eventually, however, something large and old awoke. This force causes the people in the story to take new stock of one another, begin to sing together, and weep to be reminded of such color. This large and old force coming back to life after being suppressed by hatred and destruction can be read as compassion, which reminds people of the brilliant and varied colors of the world. This awakening of compassion also brings healing to the ravaged land, replacing storms with a different manner of weather, and coaxing animals long believed gone down from trees. Of an old story, Smith has written, "I wrote this poem thinking it might be nice to take a stab at creating a new myth that takes the failings of the 21st century and fashions them into a story that culminates in humankind finding its way to a compassionate existence." The healing of relationships between humans themselves, as well as between humans and the natural world that takes place in the poem, comes from a reassessment of how the world functions and whom those functions serve. This reassessment facilitates a creation of a society based on compassionate structures. Because the poem depicts a new society, it demonstrates compassion's ability to incite expansive structural change, not merely individual transformation and community support. An old story thus illustrates the way in which compassion gives social movements the power and scope to dismantle oppression at its roots. Near the beginning of Wade in the Water, we read, "For our own good, we have to answer for all that has happened." The collection as a whole offers up compassion as a way to answer for the injustices described therein. Tracy K. Smith's book joins other contemporary Black liberation theorists like Bell Hooks, Brittany Cooper, and Charlene Carruthers in offering up a vision of a compassionate society that recognizes the value in all humanity and the earth, and that is committed to comprehensive structural change. For example, Cooper argues that compassion brings clarity that tells us what kind of world we want to see, and Carruthers adds that compassion helps us to identify connections and value people enough to believe we can be transformed. Compassion creates care for others and turns such care into action toward concrete change. Further, Akiba Solomon and Kenraya Rankin note in their book, How We Fight White Supremacy, a field guide to Black resistance, that compassion is not a magical quick fix, but can be a guiding force that creates an enduring form of resistance that is radical, expansive, and transformative at its core. Compassion guides people towards structural change, and thus is essential to truly remove systems of domination, rather than focusing only on singular instances of oppression. In her touchstone essay, Poetry is Not a Luxury, Audre Lorde asserts that poetry forms the quality of light within which we predicate our hopes and dreams towards survival and change, thus laying the foundations for a future of change. Compassion makes the necessity of such change clear, but it is also the tool by which that change is accomplished. Poetry gives us a place to hint at possibility made real. In this vein, Wade in the Water creates a world in which to explore the radical revolution that compassion can enact if we let it guide our actions and institutions. Wade in the Water urges us to start cultivating such compassionate revolution. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Kaitlin. That's a really interesting, engaging paper. We have a couple of questions here. So let me start. One from Lear, who says watching in a place where he can't really talk. So he's asked that I read this paper. So he says, I'll just read the question. While building parallels between exploitation and land and people, how does the author, but I think he means Smith here, distinguish the humanity of people as to not equate them with land or property?
Definitely. That's a really good question, and something that is important because it could definitely start to be problematic if you are only equating people with, sort of like this resource to be exploited. But I think the importance of this connection is in the fact that it is so problematic to equate people with objects or a resource for profit. So I think the way that that Smith articulates it rather than sort of reifying this idea of Black people or Indigenous people as property, as almost like machines for economic growth. She makes it clear how problematic that is. And throughout the book, her presentation of different aspects of Black life is very rich and varied. And so the other poems also help combat the possibility of presenting Black people as objects by sort of showing their full humanity.
Great. Okay, thank you. That's very interesting. All right, we have a question from Renata Forsty, the Kennedy Center Director. So Renata, please go ahead.
Sure. Hi, Caitlin. Appreciate your presentation. So the question I have just is, how do you think we could move towards compassionate community that Smith calls for, given the extreme diversity and contention that we have in the US right now?
I think it's really difficult. And it's made more difficult by the fact that you can't really legislate it or force anybody else to sort of think this way or see other people this way. So I think it starts with yourself. And this is something that I've been thinking about, sort of as I wrote this paper and in the current political climate, I have realized, sort of like it is on each individual person to expand their imagination and to see other people more complexly, and to see that their problems are different, but also worthy of consideration. So obviously I'm not an expert in this, and 9 days out of 10, I'm very discouraged. I don't know how to make other people see that. But I think the most effective thing you can do besides voting is to sort of cultivate that in yourself and try to present that viewpoint to the people in your life.
Okay, thank you, Caitlin. I think we have probably have time for one or two more questions. I'm going to sort of jump in, use the moderator's privilege here, and I have a question that's not maybe directly concerned with race, but I'm interested, especially in Wade in the Water, and I will confess not to being very familiar with Tracy Smith's work. How much, just I'm talking about in literary terms, does this sort of tradition of Black oral culture enter into her work and influence the form and the themes? Because it seems like in the two poems you show us, right, that seems to be a very important presence.
Yeah, it really is. It's kind of interesting in this book in particular, which is called Wade in the Water. Many Black poets sort of write in dialect, and Tracy K. Smith doesn't really do that. So in some ways, she is a little bit doesn't show sort of Black or African American oral culture in the same way that other Black poets do, but in many ways she does. We have the story or poem about the Geechee Gullah ring shouters, where she's highlighting dance and culture and language that is directly passed down from Black heritage, and she does that in other ways as well. But that is a really interesting question to think about as you read the book, because of the ways she kind of moves away from some traditional Black poetic techniques.
Interesting. So definitely influenced, but seems to be, trying to create her own voice, maybe independently, or influenced by it, but not equivalent to it. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's ask one more question from Emma Keddington. She's asked that I read it again. What has been one of the most influential experiences for you that has helped you see people with the kind of compassion you were talking about?
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question. One of the things that has been really influential is my own identity as a queer person, where obviously that's not the same thing as being a racial minority, but some form of marginalization or oppression often helps you sort of recognize the other problems in the world. And then another thing that has been really influential is the English major and the texts that I have read and the classes that I've taken. As I say in my paper, poetry and literature in general, I think is a really important tool for kind of getting outside your own experience and starting to recognize other people's individuality, their problems, their complexities. And so that has been really influential for me. Books like Tracy K. Smith's poetry, but also Toni Morrison, Yaa Gyasi, James Baldwin, you know, and so many others, especially contemporary writers, have been really influential on me.
Okay, thank you so much, Caitlin. We're grateful for your presentation. Thank you for taking the time and sharing your work with you. And we'll let you head off to your class. And again, congratulations on your graduation next week.
And thank you all so much for the great questions.
Great, thank you. Okay, we will now hear from our second presenter, Aisha Lehman. And again, following her presentation, we'll have a brief question and answer period. And again, I'll invite you to submit your questions to me through the chat. Aisha Lehman is an artist based in Provo. She is currently in BYU's Studio Art BFA program with minors in Sociology and Africana Studies. She is an artist and researcher grappling with the complexities of identity and race, ethnicity, gender, and spirituality. As she researches, she examines academic studies as well as her own gathered materials on others' personal experiences and narratives. She translates observations into imagery using paper, patterns, drawing, and printmaking techniques. She's preparing for an upcoming solo show at the Finch Lane Gallery in Salt Lake City. And we'll see some of this technique of hers at work here in her presentation, which is entitled No Mixing. So, Aisha.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. W.E.B. Du Bois famously stated, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." It asserts that a divide exists between Black and white individuals on an institutional and interpersonal level, advantaging white people disproportionately. The housing market is a strong example of this racial division. It is characterized by white individuals who are still granted privileges that Black people are not, and Black individuals who continue to face discrimination that white people do not. Mixed race individuals, on the other hand, challenge this stark color division theory by occupying a middle ground, privileged through their whiteness and disadvantaged through persistent racism and anti-Blackness. This Intalio print was an exploration of these ideas. The design was loosely based on a graph from a study by Ryan Gabriel, analyzing the neighborhood demographics where mixed race households reside. If you blur your eyes and rush past, the image looks fairly mixed and equitable. If you were to pause and observe the piece, you might notice rows of monochromatic homes, the scattered mixed tone homes in between, other patterns and clustering, and a general gradient with wider homes closer to the top of the landscape and blacker homes clustered towards the bottom. After printing multiple editions, I created a sequential mixed media series in order to tell a more holistic, historical, contextual, and emotional narrative. For each of these pieces, I will read the title and subtitle, followed by a discussion of the literature and research that influenced the imagery. So this first one here is number 1, no mixing. The purposeful and not accidental racial hierarchy that is segregation. The print illustrates the ongoing social phenomenon of segregation and the subsequent outcomes in people's lives. White households are the most segregated of all racial groups, where the average white resident lives in a neighborhood that is 75% white. This segregation persists independent of income, as evidenced by the fact that Black households making over $50,000 a year are just as segregated as those making minimum wage. There's more than just personal preference at play in the housing market. A strategic system of oppression that varies dependent on a person's race has created the hierarchy that is segregation. Number 2, the foreboding prospect of mixing. The South doesn't care how close a Negro gets just so he doesn't get too high. The North doesn't care how high he gets just so he doesn't get too close. This old saying refers to the Great Migration and subsequent white flight. The Great Migration began in the early 1900s during the Jim Crow era. Rural Black individuals and families moved to the North to find work as well as flee racist terrorism in the South. As the saying indicates, white Southern states used racist tactics to subordinate Black people. White Northerners, on the other hand, fled the neighborhoods Black people began moving into. White residents claimed they were being invaded, taken over, and threatened. Those who could afford to move did, leaving to the suburbs. Number 3, then the white man screamed, "No mixing." White flight was one of 2 racist reactionary tactics to maintain residential segregation. The other tactic, termed white fight, used violent fear tactics and policies to maintain a racial distance. With the passing of the Fair Housing Act of 1968, segregation no longer had legal backing. In retaliation and direct contradiction to this supposed equalizing legislation, government aid such as the GI Bill and subsidized loans were strategically accessible to white residents and denied people of color. Real estate agents sold newly available housing at above market rates to Black residents with no other options. Ghettos formed when Black residents were forced into rundown slums that were often more expensive than the suburbs. Freeway and other infrastructure projects reinforced ghetto areas by relocating and forcing Black residents into high-rise public housing complexes that were cut off from basic municipal services. Poverty, dilapidated housing, and overcrowding led to sickness, crime, and homelessness. These outcomes reinforce white fear and stereotyping of Black communities, thus justifying even more racist and discriminatory tactics, such as redlining, withholding maintenance funding for infrastructure in Black neighborhoods, and gerrymandering school district boundaries, to name a few. On a neighborhood level, white residents also use their power to keep undesirable Black residents away from their neighborhoods. Initially, racial restrictions written in neighborhood contracts established that no person other than one of the white Caucasian race could live in the area unless they were a domestic servant. Later, seemingly more covert contracts such as exclusionary zoning established the acceptable distance between houses, ensuring that no new Black neighbors would attempt to build in the area. Sundown towns placed signs outside of their neighborhoods stating things such as "whites only within city limits after dark," "we want white tenants in our white community," or "integration is a moral sin." When such messages weren't heeded and Black residents moved in anyway, white residents turned to vandalism and even terrorism, from breaking windows to lighting homes on fire. These oppressive, inhumane tactics to create and maintain segregation translated into oppressively inhumane circumstances in the lives of Black people. Black residents faced unequal access to educational, economic, and job opportunities. Intergenerational wealth in the form of home ownership, health, and social capital was inaccessible. Basic needs such as healthcare, transportation, and food were cut off, not to mention increased exposure to environmental hazards. Urban unrest ensued out of sheer desperation. Uprisings took place within Black communities such as Watts, Harlem, and Detroit. While many white people viewed these communities as riotous looters instigated by undesirables, many Black residents knew these acts were an attempt to revolt against racial oppression and demand justice. Police continued to surveil Black neighborhoods for crime more than white neighborhoods, thus perpetuating overrepresentation of Black people in the criminal justice system and subsequent negative stereotypes. Ultimately, segregation was by no means organic or natural. It was deliberately built and maintained by white people in power using racial justifications to reap racist results. While the use of red ink at first felt like a gross intrusion on the clean print, after unpacking the above-mentioned historical context, perhaps the red ink was the only appropriate and illustrative means to embody the physical and psychological violence whiteness has historically inflicted on Blackness. Notice how the ink smears on certain homes more than others and is often illegible. How might this illegibility embody the nuance of white fight? These themes in this imagery will return later in the series and give significant context for our contemporary racial climate. Number 4, a happy post-racial era of mixing. Mixed bodies blurring the racial hierarchy that is segregation. This piece's title strikes an offhandedly optimistic tone in comparison to the previous piece. First, it refers to a post-racial era, meaning the belief that we now live in a time when race is no longer relevant and racism no longer rampant. citing any racial progress as proof. This piece, along with each sequential work, will refer to and challenge this notion of a post-racial era by portraying ongoing racial hierarchies. Second, the title references mixed-race individuals. Anti-miscegenation laws prohibited interracial marriage until the Loving versus Virginia Supreme Court ruling in 1967. Anti-mixing sentiments were in large part an attempt to maintain segregation, since mixed-race people embodied a threat to the stark color divide and racial hierarchy. Nonetheless, the US witnessed a multiracial movement of sorts, as early as the dismantling miscegenation laws, up until the more recent 2000 US Census change, allowing for the option to select multiple racial categories. Despite this progress, the white racial hierarchy persists. While many researchers cite the growing multiracial population in America as the pivotal hope for a post-racial era, others argue that an adaptive racial hierarchy will simply ensue. Researchers who specifically study the residential mobility of mixed-race people have found that these households simply occupy a middle ground, rendering the rigid racial order as partially mutable, but by no means dismantled. At first glance, this art piece seems beautiful. It reflects a blended, optimistic, multiracial, celebratory, post-racial landscape. It may feel especially so for those of us who have had the privilege to live at or near the top. It is quite a different story and reality for those who perpetually have been kept at or near the bottom. As later pieces will indicate, mixed-race people have not fixed the problem of segregation. A gradient is still not integration. It is a hierarchy. Number 5, mixing bodies, not homes. Using mixed bodies to evince a post-racial era despite the purposeful and not accidental monoracial hierarchy that is segregation. Certain studies indicate that US neighborhoods are becoming increasingly diverse. Unfortunately, this is not entirely true. Many of these studies showing increased integration rely on data that measures homes by single race categories and do not track multiracial identities. Researchers who have begun using data that allows for multiracial identification reveal that supposed integrated spaces are in fact inhabited by mixed race households. Ultimately, single race households, such as monoracial white families or monoracial Black families, are still strikingly segregated and clustered. Once again, mixed race people and a lack of adequate data on mixed race identities emit a false sense of racial progress and mask persistent racial divisions. Number 6, mixing, not matching. Social acceptance, depending on how approachable and white someone's phenotype and culture is in a post-racial era. How then are mixed-race individuals sorted within this hierarchy? How do racist ideologies and policies sort interracial couples and multiracial individuals? One major factor is skin tone, or in other words, colorism. Colorism refers to a system of inequality that affords special advantages to lighter-skinned minorities because of their closer phenotypic resemblance and presumed genetic similarity to Eurocentric standards of beauty, morality, intellect, and status. For example, researchers have found that lighter skin-toned Black people have greater opportunities than darker skin-toned Black people in education, income, and employment, and are less likely to face discrimination in the health sector, the labor market, and the criminal justice system. One researcher notes that skin tone should be understood not as a binary Black and white categorization, but rather as a continuum with associated privileges and disadvantages depending on proximity to whiteness. This proximity to whiteness also applies to behavior and presentation. White people are more accepting of non-white people when they act white or assimilate to white cultural norms. Number 7, a post-racial era white man whispers, no mixing. This piece is not the same as print number 3. Rather than depicting white fight tactics of the mid to late 20th century, this print addresses our society today and persistent measures used to maintain segregation. What similarities and differences do you notice? In terms of white flight, white residents continue to avoid or leave neighborhoods when non-white residents move in. One researcher calls this the racial tipping point, where white people accept a certain amount of racial mixing before they choose to relocate to a wider monoracial area. As far as white fight, while government aids such as the GI Bill no longer racially discriminate, this past injustice has impacted generations of inheritable familial wealth. It continues to cost residents more to live in ghetto or other impoverished neighborhoods than whiter and higher socioeconomic areas in cities. While our modern legislation does not allow for explicit racial restrictions, covertly racialized tactics include apartment applications specifically blocking people who depend on some form of government welfare or may have minor misdemeanors. Public housing and other government attempts to subsidize impoverished city residents have loopholes in which landlords and real estate agents can use racial steering or deny applications based on their racist biases, making it extremely difficult to move out of impoverished areas. Municipal policies such as the placement of sewage treatment plants, city improvement and maintenance funding, gerrymandering school boundaries, property taxes determining school funding, and general lack of political representation are all used to perpetuate racist segregation. While sundown towns may no longer technically exist, consider how gated communities work to maintain racial divisions, or how Confederate flags outside of homes pose a violent threat against Black people. Neighborhood-inflicted vandalism and terrorism may have declined, but consider rampant evictions that leave people homeless, such as in Milwaukee, where roughly 16 families are evicted every day. Thousands of people must live on the streets every year because, for the myriad of reasons listed before, it is impossible for these individuals to keep up with rent. To this day, oppressive, inhumane tactics used to maintain segregation translate into oppressively inhumane circumstances in the lives of Black people disproportionately. Black residents continue to face unequal access to educational, economic, and job opportunities more than any other racial group. Intergenerational wealth in the form of homeownership, health, and social capital is often inaccessible. Basic needs such as healthcare, transportation, and food are cut off, not to mention increased exposure to environmental hazards. To this day, urban unrest ensues out of sheer desperation. To this day, uprisings take place within Black communities, which white people continue to label as riotous looters instigated by undesirables. To this day, many Black residents know that these acts are an attempt to revolt against racial oppression and demand justice. Police continue to surveil Black neighborhoods for crime more than white neighborhoods, thus perpetuating overrepresentation of Black people in the criminal justice system and subsequent negative stereotypes. Once again, we see that segregation is not a natural occurrence. It is deliberately built and maintained by white people in power using racist justifications to establish racist policies. Number 8, not racist white people who happen to not be mixing in a post-racial era. Works such as Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility and Eduardo Bonilla Silva's Racism Without Racists explore the myriad of ways in which white people are able to talk about race through coded language that does not explicitly reference race, but nonetheless works to convey a racialized and racist message. Words such as good neighborhood or good schools both carry with them implications of a white and therefore desirable neighborhoods. A white person does not need to explicitly state racial demographics in order to illustrate their race-based point about an area. On the other hand, words such as urban, dangerous, underprivileged, diverse, and sketchy have the opposite implications of a Black and therefore undesirable neighborhood. Other phrases with the same outcome include bad neighborhood, had to buy a gun, afraid to leave the house, you get what you pay for, or even, you don't know how dangerous it is over there, they don't cotton to white folks over there. This last quote was said to a field researcher on his way to move into a predominantly Black neighborhood. Other expressions such as, oh, I love mixed people, or I have Black and Hispanic friends, I'm not racist, seek to prove that one's celebration of diversity exempts them from the racist system in which we are all a part. Similar tactics such as my neighborhood has a Black person imply that a single resident of color makes the neighborhood racially integrated. Racism doesn't exist, or there's no problem, society's fine the way it is. Claim that we are in a post-racial era and completely ignore those who suffer the consequences of segregation, while phrases such as no Black people want to live here or everyone struggles, but if you work hard, ignores the structural forces of segregation. Coded language may seem minor, but it has monumental impacts. It works to perpetuate racist ideologies, which perpetuates racist policies, which perpetuates segregation, which perpetuates racial disparities. Ultimately, these words are used by white people in power and privilege to maintain an us versus them mentality. It ignores the humanity of those who are subordinated through this system. Once more, the ink on this image is blurred and difficult to read in places, sometimes completely illegible. What can that signify to us about the nuanced and covert place racism holds in our everyday conversations? Number 9, humanizing mixing, an unrealized post-racial era landscape. Integration has the power to equalize the opportunities and life outcomes of all individuals. These homes represent more than just categorical racial groups in a statistical study. They are individuals with complex identities, dreams and hopes, struggles and pains, and each with the human right for equality. When it comes to integration, though, and the idealistic light in which we place it, we must be vigilant about our central aims and attitudes. Researchers generally talk about this in terms of people of color wanting to move to higher socioeconomic white neighborhoods, but seldom discuss the isolation and racism people of color must face residing in all white spaces. Integration should not mean Black residents must assimilate to white idealized standards. This type of assimilationist racism does more harm to Black individuals than empower them. The question then becomes, what are white residents doing for neighborhoods to be safe spaces for people of color that can amplify their cultures? What are white residents doing to integrate themselves into non-monoracial white areas without imposing white idealized standards such as gentrification? Number 10, no mixing. The purposeful and not accidental racial hierarchy that is segregation. This presentation focuses primarily on white, Black, and mixed race Black individuals. Mixed white Black individuals, but overlooks the histories and experiences of a myriad of other people of color in the housing market, including Indigenous, Latinx, Polynesian, Asian, Middle Eastern, and many more identities that make up America. Because racial disparities in the housing market are largest between Black people and white people, this information does indicate a great deal about the American landscape and spectrum of advantages and disadvantages therein. That said, Black and white racial groups are not a monolith. My aim here was to break down stereotypes, not to uphold them. Unfortunately, this presentation does not go into the plethora of individual experiences within. While this information is generalized, it should not nonetheless strike us as unjust and unequal. We each play a role in this complex system of racism and inequality. It is this complexity and segregation and racism in America that drove me to interpret it in a visual form, thereby allowing a space for complexity and nuance. The prints seek to invite viewership, to learn information, but more profoundly leave with an introspective mindset to contemplate where we each fit within this framing of American life. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Aisha. Really interesting, engaging presentation. And we have a few questions coming in. I'm gonna combine a couple of questions. I guess some people were not clear that those prints that you show in the variation were actually your work as well. So could you just talk a little bit about that artistic process and what you did, how you sort of came up with the project, and describe a little bit about that process?
Definitely, yeah. So I worked as a research assistant for Dr. Ryan Gabriel, and he does a lot of research on the residential mobility of mixed race couples. And in order to understand that, I also had to learn more about just the history of the housing market in the U.S. And I recently ended that position, and I just really wanted to interpret all of this information overload I was getting from that job, and I synthesized my notes and figured out how I could portray that in a visual way. And so yeah, I did make those. Like I said at the beginning, they're Intalio Prints, which is simply you make a copper plate, and there's a bunch of chemical processes, but you ink the plate and you're able to print it multiple times by hand, just a traditional printing press. And then later on, I went on and added mixed media on top. So some of those were collage, the more skin toned papers, that was paper that I made. And then other times it was ink drawings on top. And so, yeah.
Great, thank you very much. We have a question from Daisy. Daisy, if you would unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
Hi, Aisha. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Your research is incredible, and I hope it lives on. So as you've taught us this during this lecture, we have forced African Americans to live in this structural poverty because we failed to help them after emancipation, right? So we failed so much in the Reconstruction era, and now the repercussions are here. So what type of ideas are in your mind, or what type of ideas did you get when you were researching with Dr. Gabriel about how to integrate our housing market? What type of policies, what type of reparations do we need to ensure that African Americans and other races, other non-white people are in fair and equal housing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think this project definitely pointed to a big problem rather than offering solutions. And honestly, a lot of the books and research that I read, I mean, the solutions that they offered were kind of a couple pages at the end, like here's some things that could work, and it was kind of depressing that there wasn't more. But some of the ideas that they talked about was that the local governments can do so much to advertise neighborhoods in their cities and say, hey, you know, move here, and talk about the pros of integration and just diversity. Because so often, like I said, there's coded language about, you know, certain areas that you don't want to go to, but there are so many advantages to our cities becoming more integrated with so many perspectives. And so cities can do a big part in advertising and enticing people to move to areas in less racist language. Another thing that was talked about, nowadays they've kind of moved away from public housing projects, and there's more voucher programs where, you know, certain people can apply and they get a voucher to be able to move into a neighborhood that they wouldn't be able to afford on their own. And as great as those sound, there are still a lot of ways that landlords are able to like discriminate against these people. So even though people are having these great housing vouchers, or they can move to just a higher socioeconomic area, they're still being forced into areas that just don't offer them the opportunities that they need for their families. And so I think there's a lot of policies in place right now that are really promising, but there hasn't been too much evaluation and like reconstructing those to get rid of the biases. Because as much as there's like great policies, there will always be these biased forces up against it. So I don't know, I highly recommend the books, Cycle of Segregation. The last couple of chapters talk about that. And then also the book Evicted is a field study where, you know, someone lived he lived in a couple different places, but he was just looking at eviction and really goes into depth about, you know, what programs are in place, but what's not working about those programs. So anyway, those are two books that I found very informative.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Daisy. We have a question here from Isaiah again, who's asking me to read it. So, and this is maybe just a practical question that comes around, that arises from this discussion. So he asks, why haven't those projects for integration started yet, or what's stopping them? Is it you know, structural? Is it individual resistance? How would you explain that perpetual, you know, segregation even after laws and things have been passed?
Yeah, I think everyone would love to know the answer to that question. That's really hard, but I think, I mean, this group has read Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, and he really stresses that, you know, if we focus too much on individuals, we forget the power that policies have, and that we need to dismantle those first. And I think he makes an excellent point. It almost seems like we have to come from every angle, right? Like looking at myself, like how do I perpetuate these ideas within myself and within my own circles? But then we have to go further, right? And look at what's happening on a policy level. I think also, I mean, there's just so many societal issues and problems that I think problems that don't affect people personally kind of get put on the back burner. And so, yeah, I was gonna say something else, but I think it left me. But yeah, I just think, oh, there's a podcast called Nice White Parents, and it's all about the way that these New York families and parents went into a fairly diverse neighborhood and kind of overtook the entire school system to fit their white idealized ideologies and systems of public schooling and things like that. And I think that podcast really points to the ideas that we have about whiteness being the standard, the best way to do things, and the ways that that's not actually true. And I think that podcast really shines a light on like why a lot of these problems of segregation and gentrification occur and are perpetuated, because it's just so ingrained in us to think a certain way, like this is the one way things have to be. So anyway, there's another resource I would recommend.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I've heard that podcast as well. Really interesting, and it does make you think, right? That yeah, what if I think I'm well intentioned, does that excuse me from maybe doing things that still contribute to this problem? All right. Well, we maybe have time for one more question, so I'm going to ask. Okay, Leslie Hadfield, Africana Studies coordinator. She has a question for you as well.
Thank you, Aisha. That was it was so great to get to see these again, and they're just incredible. I'm sure there's so much to each one, and I had a question comparing the two with the red ink. So number 3, I was drawn to the image in both of them. First of all, I think in number 3 it was the image of the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Is that correct? Okay.
Yeah.
So I wondered what the meaning behind that was, and then I can't remember what number it was, 7 or 8.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's the other bridge. So I wondered if you would talk about those 2 images and why you put them there.
Yeah, I don't know if you remember, but at one point I wrote, you know, the way that people in the past viewed these protests that were happening in Black communities and citing them as riotous and looters and undesirables, whereas the communities themselves recognized, you know, they were doing what they could to get their voices heard about these issues that people were completely ignoring. And so I thought the Edmund Pettus Bridge would be like the most recognizable protest that I could put there. And, you know, even if that one was not particularly regarding segregation, I think, you know, all these issues are intertwined. And then for the one that I did after, I just used an image of a Black Lives Matter protest, because I've this past summer, I've heard very, very similar words used to describe the protests that happened last summer. And so I definitely saw a parallel between these protests back in the 60s to 2020. So.
Great, thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Aisha. We've hit 1 o'clock. We just want to say thanks very much to you for your work, for sharing it with us. We'll also say thanks to Caitlin, even though she's not with us right now. But again, just really interesting work, and thank you for sharing it with us.